Mahalo for being with us today, Tyler. You know, it's such a privilege to meet you and to learn more a little bit about Department of Hawaiian Homelands.
Thank you for having me here. It's very exciting and it's an honor to be a part of this, especially for all the episodes that you've done. So thank you again for having us.
And in the palace.
Yeah, this is an opportunity that very few get to be able to sit in these sort of spaces. The palace, I think, has had a storied history where it was not always accessible. So I think it's a really beautiful symbol that we're getting to do it here.
Well, especially when we're talking about Hawaiian Homelands, not always being accessible.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit more about what you do and what's the future?
Well, Hawaiian Homelands is a product of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. And that is a pretty monumental piece of legislation. So we're finishing our 100th year of existence, which is crazy to think about because we predate statehood, we predate many of the other agencies. And what's really important about the program is Prince Kuhio was the champion of it, and he was a non-voting delegate in Congress at the time. He was a Native Hawaiian man surrounded by most likely an all-white Congress, and even without any voting authority, he convinced them that homesteading on lands that would be inalienable, meaning that you could never give them up, specifically for Native Hawaiians for 99 years, was a worthwhile and meritorious endeavor. And here we are 100 years later, and I think he was right. And I think for everyone who voted on it at the time, I think they would agree that being able to provide access to land and housing for Native Hawaiians, which is what we do at our core, has value even 100 years later.
So let's talk a little bit more about housing. You know, there's a philosophy here of single family homes and ownership and condos. Besides the pricing, can you help us navigate through that?
Well, for Department of Hawaiian Homelands, like I mentioned, we only serve Native Hawaiians who are of 50% blood quantum or greater, or their qualifying descendants who are 25% or greater. So we have a limited audience. That said, when we look at what the demand is, we know that 76% of those waiting, they want a single family home. But the reality is when you look at all 200,000 acres that DHHL manages, a third of it is preservation and conservation land, so it's not even suitable for putting homes on. We've got cliff sides in Waimanalo. We have watersheds that need to be preserved. So rather quickly, where you can build starts to shrink. Oahu has the longest wait list out of all of our island holdings, and we have the least amount of available land on Oahu. So when we try to address the need of the 76% of Native Hawaiians waiting for a single family home, we have to start to shift the direction of, if we cannot continue to build homes, if it's no longer sustainable to keep putting down these massive homes, how else can we serve you? How else can we help you achieve housing? And that's a very different question from how can we put you in a turnkey single family home? Sometimes that looks like rentals. I mean, it's no secret that housing is no longer affordable in Hawaii, right? The median home price just hit $1.2 million, which is obscene. My parents' generation, my parents bought the home that I grew up in for $300,000. Unheard of.
You grew up in the country, though, right? In Kailua.
I don't know if we would call Kailua country now, but
Right.
when my dad was growing up there, you know, it was country. And to see it rapidly change to a very speculative market of these just incredibly expensive homes, the dream of home ownership, especially for my generation and the generations who are coming after me, is almost completely out of reach in a lot of these areas. And that's just, it shouldn't sit right by us, which is where DHHL serves a very beautiful mission, right? These are our lands. These are lands set aside for the Lahui, for Kanaka. And so we create these kipuka of identity because you're living in a Hawaiian place. You're living with Hawaiian neighbors. Someday, that's not going to just look like single family homes. There will be Hawaiian Homeland condominiums. There will be Hawaiian Homeland rentals. Does that meet what everybody wants? Maybe not. But I think we need to start to shift the direction of, how do we stop Native Hawaiians from fleeing the state and moving to cities like Las Vegas? And if we want that to be the goal, how do we shift our perspective of what it means to live in Hawaii?
And isn't part of that conversation also vocabulary?
It is.
But when you speak about housing, but Hawaiian homelands, it's a different concept.
Well, homesteading is a very old concept, right? And it's a Western concept. The earliest homesteading programs in Hawaii failed. I mean, that's why DHHL exists, because Kuhio saw the prior homesteading programs not succeeding. the impetus for DHHL was not just residential, it was how do we provide agricultural homesteading opportunities on Hawaiian
So it's
homelands.
economic
That's right.
environment as well.
And pastoral, right? Ranching was a big deal in the early 1900s. Now we look around, is there a demand for a lot of ranching lands? Maybe, but we have so few. And is it economic for Hawaiian families to get into ranching? For some, yes, for others, no. Same thing for ag. Part of the problem is, and this goes to vocabulary, coming out of the 80s through the 2000s, the legislature really shifted to seeing DHHL as a housing agency. And DHHL became measured on how many homes are you building. And so what you see is after the 80s, we haven't given out an agricultural award in over 20 years, which is a shame. But that's because the public and the legislature, they measure our success on how many residential homes have you built. And we don't want to look like failures. So you see this pivot in the course of DHHL history to meeting that need. And that's another thing I think we have to shift is the reality of, is residential homes the only way to measure DHHL success? I'd argue no.
Well, and especially when we have the conversation also about grow local, buy local, and the fact that we're 99% reliant on everything we import. So how do we make that transition?
Well, part of it is stronger education. I mean, the department could be doing better in terms of providing agricultural support for those lessees who are on agricultural parcels. But it's also sort of measuring expectations. Many Kanaka farmers are their gentleman farmers, right? They farm for themselves. They farm in a subsistence way. And that's very different from the Western commercialized concept of how do I spread my farm out onto as many acres as possible and maximize the amount of crops I'm outputting. That's not the dream vision or goal for many of our Kanaka lessees. So what we've seen the department transition to in the last few years is a new award type. So it's called subsistence agricultural, smaller than the traditional ag lot, maybe a half acre, which is a lot more manageable. Kupuna, the older you get, you cannot be on 3 acres trying to farm all of your fruits. So we're giving smaller lots with fewer restrictions, fewer expectations. Trying to make it easier. And I think that speaks to what I'd like to see for the future, not just for Hawaiian Homeland, but how do we tackle housing in general is how do we make these pathways easier for people to accomplish what they need to, whether it's farming, living in a single family home, getting their keiki or their mo'opuna into rentals. How do we make it easier? And there are many parts I think we can all agree. You are in government, so you know government does not always make it the easiest. And so, at least for me, one of the goals is how do we decrease barriers in these pathways?
Is there also an encouragement to go neighbor islands?
There is. And we have far more available lands on the neighbor islands. But what does that come down to? It comes down to legislative funding. And that depends on who is in charge of the funding, which you are also aware of. And so, you go through cycles in the legislature, and Kauai might be a priority one year, Maui another, Hawaii Island a different year. So these projects are staggered and they're prioritized based on politics, and that can make it difficult. But the reality is we do need to focus and encourage people to think about living on other islands. One of the biggest challenges the department has is many folks have been on the wait list for a very long time. I'll admit that. But when you talk to many of them, they've received 6, 10, 20 offers in the last 30, 40 years. No one talks about that. And one of the primary reasons people turn down their lots is they don't want to move. They don't want to go to another place. And I think in some ways that's very honorable, right? Because as Kanaka, we're tied to where we are, or tied to the land. But at the same time, the vision that Kuhio had was you go make it work wherever you have to go and make it work if you want to succeed. And so the neighbor islands are certainly a priority for the department. And I think if we can get people to embrace the idea of accepting the challenge, then expanding out, we can at least stop them from being forced to leave altogether, right? If your choice was to go move to Missouri or maybe figure it out on Molokai, I would hope you would think about choosing Molokai.
So as we wrap up our conversation for today, can you give us a message of hope for the future?
Sure. I think, this was a pretty miraculous year for the department. We received $600 million from the legislature, which is the largest amount of money that's ever been allocated to the department in its 100-year history. And I think that's a credit to the department really rising to the occasion, especially through the pandemic, and saying yes to big ideas. And I think my hope for not just DHHL, but government in general, is that we're willing to embrace the possibility of trying new things and trying big things and potentially controversial things, because what can happen is you get these offshoots of hope and passion from our legislators, from our, our amazing staff, even from members of the public. And I think if we embrace it as a kako thing, which I think you and I talked about before our chat this morning, you know, that's really where some of the best ideas come from, is the possibility of what can we do versus maybe a more traditional view that comes out of government, is which is sort of no can. And my hope is that, at least for DHL, for another 100 years, we are able to address the housing needs, the land and cultural and identity needs of Kanaka, in a way that meets everyone on the spectrum where they are.
Well, and sitting here in the palace, we definitely have a role model for that kind of courage.
I think it's you.
Thank you for being with us.
Mahalo.
You've just had the opportunity to meet Tyler Gomes, Deputy with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands.